There is a truth so ancient, so quiet, that it has lived longer than mountains, longer than the shifting of continents, longer even than the stars we now call old. It is not a truth etched in stone, nor one that can be read in the worn pages of a forgotten book. It is a truth woven into the very weave of existence, a subtle architecture beneath the fabric of all we see, hear, touch, and dream. It does not shout. It hums like the low resonance of the earth itself, heard only by those who have learned to still themselves enough to listen. And yet, this truth has been buried not in the way relics are buried in sand, but as rivers are buried underground, flowing invisibly beneath the surface. It was hidden, not by chance, but by intention. Covered over by centuries of distraction, by the noise of commerce and the clamor of progress, by the layered narratives of history told by those who feared its implications. It is the kind of knowledge that, if glimpsed even for an instant, can bend the shape of a life. But to hold it in your hands is to risk never being the same again. The ancients knew of it. They whispered it into the architecture of their temples. They wove it into myths, recited for thousands of years, and embedded it into the proportions of sacred art. They left clues that could survive the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, and the erosion of language. It was never meant to be forgotten, only to be guarded, like a seed kept in the dark, until the soil is ready. And perhaps, just perhaps, that soil is ready now. You may have already felt the pull of this secret, without naming it. It lives in the moments when the world seems to pause, when a shaft of light falls through the trees and catches dust motes in a way that feels like a message. It is there, in the instant before you fall asleep, when the mind loosens its grip, and another kind of clarity hovers at the edge of perception. It is in the way. A melody you've never heard before can feel familiar, as if it were an echo from somewhere beyond time. The modern world is ill-suited for hearing such things. We live in an age of constant exposure, where attention is traded like currency, and silence is treated as emptiness, rather than as the fertile ground of revelation. But the secret is not gone. It does not depend on our remembering. It simply waits like a mirror in a darkened room, reflecting nothing until the light is lit. What is buried can be uncovered. What is forgotten can be remembered. What is locked can be opened if we find the key. And the key is not made of metal, nor carved from stone. It is not a thing you can hold in your hand, but a shift you make inside yourself. The key is a way of seeing, a lens that rearranges the entire landscape of reality, revealing that the walls you once thought were the limits of your life are nothing more than painted illusions. Once you begin to look through that lens, the world starts speaking in a language you had almost forgotten you knew. Symbols rearrange themselves into messages. Coincidences begin to gather into patterns, and events, no matter how small, seem to lean toward you, as if they had been waiting to be noticed. But why bury something so powerful? The answer lies in the paradox of knowledge. Not all truth is welcomed by those who benefit from the illusion. Throughout history, the custodians of power, whether emperors, priests, or modern institutions, have known that to grant people the full scope of their reality is to risk losing control over them. If a person realizes they are not simply an isolated accident in a mechanical universe, but a conscious participant in an intricate living tapestry, then fear loses its grip. And a person without fear is very difficult to govern. So, the truth was wrapped in riddles. It was given names that could be dismissed as superstition. It was scattered into separate disciplines, part hidden in philosophy, part in science, part in religion, part in art, so that no single seeker could easily piece it together. And yet, like a river winding beneath the ground, it continued to flow, shaping the unseen contours of the world. Every now and then, someone would stumble upon it, whether by years of disciplined search or by accident, and their life would begin to shimmer with a quiet, unstoppable transformation. Perhaps you have sensed it, a strange coherence in the chaos, a feeling that there is a hidden rhythm to things. That sense is not fantasy. It is the whisper of the buried current. The ancients understood that reality was not merely matter and motion, but a vast interplay of forces, both visible and invisible. They knew that behind every object was an idea, behind every event, a pattern, and behind every pattern, a source that could not be named without diminishing it. In the language of modern thought, we might speak of consciousness, of quantum possibilities, of unified fields. In the language of the ancients, we might speak of the breath of the divine, of the music of the spheres, of the dreamer behind the dream. Both point toward the same place, the axis where the visible and invisible touch, where the material and immaterial dissolve into one continuous whole. This introduction is not a map, but an opening in the curtain. To speak of the ancient secret is not to hand you a definition, but to invite you into a way of perceiving. In the chapters ahead, we will move deeper through its core themes and concepts, into the symbolic narratives that hold it, into the ways it can be lived, and finally, into the transformation it invites. The path will not be straight, for no path toward the real ever is. We will circle, double back, and spiral, for the truth does not live at the end of a line, but in the depth of a pattern. You may find that what you thought was the destination is only another doorway, and when the last doorway opens, you may realize that the secret was never something you discovered. It was something you remembered. If the introduction is the first crack in the curtain, then the core themes of this ancient secret are the shapes that emerge once your eyes begin to adjust to the light behind it. The mind accustomed to thinking in straight lines expects the truth to be something solid and fixed, a single statement that can be memorized and repeated. But the deeper reality is more like a constellation. You cannot see it by staring directly at it. You must soften your gaze and let the connections appear. At the heart of this secret is the recognition that reality is not merely a stage upon which you act, but a living conversation between your inner world and the outer world. The boundary between you and everything else is not the brick wall we have been taught to imagine. It is more like the surface of the ocean, shifting, permeable, and responsive. Every thought, every belief, every unspoken assumption sends ripples outward into the great sea of existence, and those ripples return to you in forms you often mistake for chance. The ancients understood that the visible is born from the invisible. They knew that the shapes we see, whether in the pattern of leaves, the orbit of planets, or the course of human lives, are crystallizations of forces that move beneath the threshold of ordinary perception. This is why they spoke so often in symbols and myths. They did not see myth as a falsehood, but as a map of the invisible, a way of giving form to what could not be captured by plain description. One of the core pillars of this secret is the idea that perception itself is creative. What you notice shapes what is possible. It is not that you invent reality out of nothing, but that you participate in the weaving of it. Two people can walk through the same forest. One sees only trees and shadows. The other sees signs, omens, a living presence. The forest responds differently to each. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is the nature of a participatory universe, where consciousness and the world are not separate entities, but two faces of the same mystery. Another theme is the interplay between pattern and freedom. The patterns are ancient cycles of growth and decay, the rise and fall of civilizations, the tides of joy and sorrow in a single life. They are not cages. They are rhythms, like the heartbeat or the phases of the moon. Within these rhythms, freedom moves like a dancer within a song. The secret lies not in escaping the pattern, but in learning to move with it so skillfully that you can improvise without losing the rhythm. The ancients often expressed this through the metaphor of the hidden order. On the surface, life can appear random, driven by accident and chaos. But beneath that surface lies an intricate geometry, not rigid, but alive, changing its expression without ever abandoning its essence. Think of it as the difference between a snowflake and a snowstorm. The snowflake's structure is precise, repeating, and elegant. Yet the storm is wild, unpredictable, and full of motion. The hidden order is not about freezing life into a fixed form. It is about seeing the elegance within the motion. The third theme that emerges is the truth about identity. Most people live as though they are a small, separate self, a temporary creature, defined by their body, their history, and their name. But the deeper truth, hinted at in the sacred traditions across cultures, is that the self is a wave in a much larger ocean. You are not simply in the universe. The universe is in you. The boundaries are local illusions, necessary for the play of life, but not ultimate. When you realize this not as an idea, but as a felt, knowing the fear of annihilation begins to dissolve. Life becomes less about defending your existence and more about expressing it fully. This is not to say that pain disappears. The secret does not promise a life without loss or difficulty. What it offers instead is a transformation in the way you meet those experiences. In the old stories, heroes and seekers are not spared hardship. They are deepened by it. The patterns of joy and sorrow, gain and loss, are still there. But they are no longer seen as random punishments or rewards. They are understood as the contours of a larger design, one in which every valley is balanced by a peak, and every ending is the seed of a beginning. And so, the ancient secret rests on a paradox. It is at once deeply personal and utterly universal. It speaks to the intimate details of your life, the relationships you cherish, the dreams you pursue, the struggles you endure, while also revealing that these details are expressions of something vast and timeless. To embrace it is to live in two worlds at once: the immediate world of your senses and the greater, quieter world that holds it. In modern language, we might try to frame these themes as principles. Consciousness shapes reality. The visible emerges from the invisible. Identity is both local and universal. Patterns guide freedom. Meaning is found in the interplay between the two worlds, but such reduction flattens them. The ancients avoided such flattening because they knew that to speak the truth too plainly was to risk stripping it of its life. The secret is not meant to be memorized like a formula. It is meant to be lived into, each day revealing a little more of its shape. Once you begin to live with this awareness, the texture of reality shifts. You start noticing the way certain moments seem to lean toward you, The way certain words appear just when you need them. The way your inner state echoes in the outer world. You begin to suspect that life has always been speaking to you, but you were listening to the wrong frequency. This is the ground we will stand on before moving deeper. The recognition that reality is participatory, that patterns underlie the flow of events, that identity is both personal and cosmic, and that meaning is not imposed, but uncovered. From here, we can step into the next layer, the symbolic narratives through which these truths have been carried across millennia, disguised as stories, myths, and parables, waiting for those with the right eyes to see. If the core themes are the skeleton of this ancient secret, then the symbolic narratives are its flesh, its living movement. The ancients understood something we often forget: truth rarely survives the naked exposure of literalism. When it is dressed in story, however, it can travel through centuries, across cultures, through the fires of conquest and the floods of forgetting, and still arrive intact. The symbols protect the essence, the way a seed's hard shell guards the life within. One such story that has surfaced in countless forms across the globe is that of the hidden key. In some tellings, it is a golden object buried deep beneath a mountain. In others, it is a word that can only be spoken in a dream. The seeker sets out to find it, believing it to be an object that will open a physical gate. But along the journey, they face trials that force them to shed their old ways of thinking, the fear of the unknown, the clinging to certainty, the urge to control. When they finally reach the place where the key is said to be hidden, they discover it is not a thing to be held at all. The key is the transformation that has occurred within them, and the gate it opens is not made of stone, but of perception. This story, in its many disguises, points to the truth that the unlocking is an inward act. It tells us that the external search through books, through travels, through the collecting of knowledge, is a mirror of the inner journey, and that the two are not separate. The treasure buried beneath the mountain is the same as the treasure buried beneath the layers of one's own conditioning. To find it, one must dig in both directions at once. Another ancient narrative is that of the veiled mirror. In this tale, there exists a mirror that reflects not your face, but your essence. It shows you the truth of who you are beyond your name, beyond your history, beyond the roles you have learned to play. But the mirror is covered by a veil, and the veil is woven from all the false identities and beliefs you have accepted as truth. Some are placed there by others, parents, teachers, society, and some you have woven yourself from fear and desire. The task of the seeker is not to polish the mirror, for it is already flawless, but to remove the veil thread by thread. Each thread taken away is a story you no longer believe, a limitation you no longer accept. And when the veil is gone, you realize the mirror was never showing you something new. It was simply returning you to yourself. Such a story speaks to the idea that the secret is not something foreign to you. It is not an exotic prize hidden in a distant land. It is the most intimate truth of your own being, hidden in plain sight, obscured only by the weight of what you have mistaken for reality. The process of revelation is less like acquiring something and more like remembering something you have always known. There is also the parable of the twin worlds, one world of shadow and one of light. In the shadow world, everything appears separate, each object defined by its edges, each person alone in their own skin. Here, people live by the laws of scarcity and fear, defending what they have against the threat of loss. The light world, however, exists in the same space, but is perceived differently. Here, boundaries are translucent, connections shimmer between all beings, Events are understood not as isolated accidents, but as notes in a larger harmony. Most people live entirely in the shadow world, unaware of the light world even as it surrounds them. But the ancient secret teaches that the two worlds are not separate places. They are two modes of perception, and the shift from one to the other is as subtle as turning your head toward the sun. These symbolic narratives do not ask to be believed in a literal sense. Their power lies in the way they bypass the rational mind's defenses and speak directly to something older in you, something that remembers. They awaken a resonance, a quiet recognition that says, "Yes, I know this place. I have been here before." And in that recognition, a doorway opens. Even the myths that seem fantastical on the surface, stories of gods walking among humans, of mountains that float in the sky, of oceans that speak, are not mere entertainments. They are encoded diagrams of the inner and outer cosmos, meant to draw your attention to patterns that exist beyond the reach of ordinary logic. When you hear of a hero descending into the underworld, you are hearing about the descent into the depths of the unconscious, the confrontation with the parts of yourself you have exiled. When you hear of a divine child born in secret, you are hearing about the emergence of a new consciousness, fragile yet luminous, that must be protected until it is strong enough to transform the whole of you. The beauty of these narratives is that they are endlessly adaptable. They can be told to a child and heard as adventure. They can be contemplated by a mystic and heard as revelation. This adaptability is no accident. It is how the secret survives. For in every age, there will be those who see only the surface of the story, and those who see its depths. The ancients understood this well, and trusted that the stories would know how to find their listeners when the time was right. And so, as we explore these symbolic landscapes, we begin to see that the ancient secret is not a single statement, but a network of living metaphors. They are threads in a tapestry that spans cultures and centuries, all pointing to the same truth. That reality is layered. That perception is the bridge between those layers, and that the greatest treasure is not found by conquering the world, but by awakening within it. In the next phase of our journey, we will step out of the realm of myth and into the weaving of the two, how the symbolic and the practical meet. For the secret, as vast as it is, has no meaning if it remains locked in the pages of ancient tales. It is meant to be lived, and to live it, we must learn how to carry it into the marketplace, the home, the body, the choices we make each day. It is one thing to feel the tremor of an ancient truth moving through the corridors of myth and metaphor. It is another to carry that truth into the places where bills are paid, children are raised, and decisions must be made under the press of time. The ancients did not preserve this secret merely for poetic contemplation. They understood that if a truth cannot find its way into the rhythms of daily living, it remains incomplete, a seed kept in a jar, never breaking soil. The hidden current that flows beneath the surface of reality is not meant only for the mountaintop. It is meant for the market square. The first step in practical integration is subtle. Learning to live as though the dialogue between your inner and outer worlds is real because it is. This does not require mystical theatrics or the adoption of an esoteric lifestyle. It begins in the smallest acts of awareness. When you wake in the morning, the moment before the rush of thought takes over, notice the quality of your first breath. When you speak to someone, sense the tone beneath their words, the silent currents of meaning. When an event, delightful or difficult, unfolds in your life, pause to ask not just why did this happen, but what is this shaping in me? Such shifts in perception ripple outward. They change the way you interpret chance meetings, sudden delays, even the patterns of your own moods. You begin to sense that life is not a random scatter of events, but a woven cloth, each thread carrying a message from the loom of the unseen. This perspective does not make you passive, quite the opposite. It makes you an active participant in the co-creation of your path. You stop waiting for meaning to arrive from outside and begin to generate it in the way you respond. In relationships, the ancient secret invites a profound reorientation. Rather than seeing others as fixed characters in the script of your life, you begin to notice how they act as mirrors reflecting aspects of yourself you might otherwise overlook. The companion who frustrates you may be drawing your attention to a hidden impatience within. The friend who inspires you may be showing you a dormant quality, ready to awaken. Even the stranger who brushes past you without a glance is part of the vast choreography that shapes your days. With this lens, every interaction becomes a moment of potential revelation. In the realm of work and creation, integration means allowing your actions to be guided not only by logic, but by a kind of inner alignment. The ancients would call this alignment by many names. Harmony the way the current, but whatever the term, it refers to the sensation that your inner state and outer action are moving in concert. When you act from that place, effort feels lighter, timing feels more precise, and outcomes often carry a quality of unexpected elegance. This is not magic, in the sense of bending the world to your will. It is the art of aligning with the patterns that are already moving through the world. Even in moments of hardship, this secret reshapes the ground beneath your feet. Difficulties cease to feel like meaningless disruptions, and instead take on the texture of necessary thresholds. Illness, loss, or disappointment no longer mark the end of the path, but the entrance into a deeper chamber of it. You begin to see the same pattern that the old myths teach: descent precedes renewal. Winter precedes spring. The seed must fall into darkness before it can open. Such a perspective does not erase grief, but it weaves that grief into a larger tapestry, giving it a place in the story rather than casting it as a senseless interruption. The integration of this secret also changes the way you inhabit time. In a culture obsessed with speed, we often live as if the present is merely a narrow bridge between the past and the future. But to live with the awareness of the hidden order is to step more fully into the present as a vast living field. The past becomes less a weight and more a reservoir of patterns. The future becomes less a source of anxiety and more a horizon that draws you forward. You stop racing toward someday and begin to work with what is directly before you, knowing that the smallest adjustment in the present can shift the shape of the entire arc ahead. In practice, this might mean honoring moments of stillness as much as moments of motion. It might mean taking time to sense into a decision rather than forcing it to fit a predetermined timetable. It might mean listening for the thread of coherence that runs through your days and allowing it to guide you even if it leads you away from the paths others expect you to follow. The more you trust this inner navigation, the more the outer world seems to conspire in your favor, not always in the way you imagined, but often in the way you most deeply need. Above all, the real-world implication of this ancient secret is the reclamation of authorship over your own reality. Not authorship in the sense of total control, for life is too vast to be mastered, but in the sense of conscious participation. You begin to write in the margins of the script handed to you. You edit the lines that no longer ring true. You add scenes that nourish the soul, and in doing so, you discover that reality is far less rigid than you were taught to believe. The ancients buried this knowledge because they knew its power. A person who understands their place in the living web cannot be easily manipulated. They cannot be made to feel small, for they know themselves as both wave and ocean. They cannot be reduced to a role, for they have tasted the freedom of moving between many. They cannot be frightened into obedience, for they see beyond the shadow world into the light. And yet, this secret is not meant to remain an individual possession. Its fullest expression is in the way it ripples outward into the way you speak, the way you create, the way you care for others, the way you stand in the presence of beauty and suffering alike. Integration is not about mastering a hidden art in isolation. It is about letting that art inform the way you shape the world you share with others. There comes a point in every journey when the road begins to dissolve behind you, and you realize there is no going back to the way things were. The ancient secret once glimpsed cannot be unseen. It rearranges the inner landscape, the way the tide reshapes the shoreline. What once seemed solid now feels permeable. What once seemed inevitable now appears as a choice. The walls you believed enclosed you reveal themselves as painted scenery, and the doors you thought were locked open at the lightest touch. This is not the end of the path, but the beginning of a deeper one. To hold this secret is to be initiated into a lifelong practice, not of hoarding knowledge, but of living in continual conversation with the unseen architecture of reality. It is not a single revelation to be checked off and set aside, but a current that will carry you into new waters again and again, if you allow it. The ancients knew that transformation is rarely a lightning strike. It is more often the slow turning of the earth toward the sun. Day by day, choice by choice, you adjust your gaze toward the deeper patterns, and with each adjustment, reality adjusts in return. It is tempting to look for grand gestures the mountain climbed, the great vow made, but the truest change comes in the quiet, the way you listen, the way you speak, the way you meet each moment, as though it were both fragile and infinite. And here lies the heart of the call. Do not treat this as a beautiful philosophy to admire from a distance. Let it change how you move through the world. Let it guide the questions you ask yourself in the still hours before dawn. Let it shape the way you respond when life offers you a threshold disguised as a challenge. Live as though the dialogue between the visible and invisible is constant, because it is. This living is not about perfection, it is about presence. You will falter, you will forget. The patterns of the shadow world are strong, and they will try to pull you back into their trance of separation and scarcity. But the more you practice, the more quickly you will remember that you are not separate, that every ending folds into a beginning, that what you perceive and what you live are inseparable. This remembering is the work, and it is also the reward. And as you live it, you will find that you become, without trying, a carrier of the secret, not by preaching it, but by embodying it in the way you stand in the stream of events. Others will notice the quality of your presence, the way you do not rush when the world rushes, the way you hold steady when the winds rise, the way your eyes seem to see something they cannot quite name. Some will ask you about it, others will simply feel it, and it will awaken in them a recognition of something they too have always known. This is how the secret moves through time, not in proclamations from the mountaintop, but in the quiet exchange of presence. It was buried, not to be lost, but to be preserved until the moment was right. And perhaps that moment is now in you. You are not a bystander to this unfolding. You are one of the living threads, part of the tapestry that has been woven since before the first dawn, holding a pattern that will continue long after the last dusk. To accept this role is to live as both participant and witness. It is to stand with one foot in the practical world of tasks and obligations, and one foot in the vastness that holds it all. It is to work, to love, to suffer, to celebrate all the while knowing that beneath every experience runs the river of the real, and that you can drink from it at any moment. So the call is simple, though never easy. Remember that you are not merely in the world, but of it. Remember that the patterns of your life are not cages, but songs, and you are both the singer and the melody. Remember that the secret is not a possession, but a relationship, one that deepens the more you tend to it. And above all, remember that you were never meant to keep it locked inside you. Let it speak through you. Let it move through your hands, your words, your choices. Let it become so woven into the way you live that those who meet you will not even hear you speak of it, yet they will feel it in their bones. For in the end, the secret that unlocks all reality is not hidden in the stars or buried under stone. It is here, in the meeting place of your awareness and the world, in the still point where the inner and outer touch, and it has been waiting patiently, quietly, for you to notice, to listen, and to live as though you belong to the great whole you have always been part of. That is the truth. They buried for a reason. That is the truth you now carry forward.